I accidentally accessed an old bank account that I hadn't touched in over a decade. To my shock, it contained $24 million. I had never seen that amount of money before in my life. The moment I discovered who had been transferring funds into it, I contacted the bank immediately. Hello, everyone. This is Diana once again. I'm happy you're joining me today. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. I never considered myself the type of person extraordinary things happen to. I was always the one who kept life running smoothly. Bills were paid on time, appointments were scheduled, birthdays were remembered, and household responsibilities stayed organized. I maintained detailed spreadsheets for our family budget and still managed to bake on Sunday mornings. My life was simple, structured, and predictable. My name is Margaret Collins, though most people call me Maggie. I'm 46 years old and live in Oak Park, Illinois, a suburb west of Chicago. I work as a senior accountant for a logistics company. I have 2 children, Tyler, 22, who is completing graduate school in Michigan, and Dana, 19, who is studying nursing in Indianapolis. After my divorce, I raised them largely on my own. For years, I convinced myself that I was doing fine. Perhaps I was, at least in the way people become accustomed to carrying quiet sadness in the background of their lives. It was the kind of grief that never fully disappears, but becomes part of your routine. About a year before everything changed, a few details started bothering me. Nothing dramatic, just small inconsistencies. One day, a mutual acquaintance casually mentioned that my ex-husband, Derek, had recently purchased a vacation property in Scottsdale, Arizona. I smiled and responded politely, but something about it stayed with me. Derek had worked as a sales consultant. He was successful, but not the kind of successful that usually leads to buying vacation homes. Especially not after claiming during our divorce proceedings 10 years earlier that he had very limited liquid assets. A couple of months later, my son Tyler mentioned running into Derek at a restaurant in Chicago. He casually noted that his father was wearing a watch that looked unbelievably expensive. Again, I tried to dismiss it. People's circumstances change. It was no longer my concern, or so I told myself. Still, the pieces didn't seem to fit together. Everything truly began on a gray Wednesday afternoon in October. I was working from home and sorting through old financial records that had been piling up for years. While digging through a box of forgotten paperwork, I found an envelope from a bank called First Meridian Financial. At first, I almost threw it away. The bank's name didn't seem familiar because it had since been acquired and rebranded under another institution, but something made me open it. Inside was an annual account statement from 2014. The account balance listed was $847.32. Nothing unusual. Yet I had no memory of opening such an account. That night, the document stayed on my mind. I had always been meticulous with financial records. Forgetting an account simply wasn't like me. The next day, I discovered that First Meridian had become part of Great Lakes Federal Bank. During my lunch break, I called customer service and provided my identifying information. After checking the records, the representative informed me that an active account existed under my name. When I asked for the current balance, she paused before answering. The account contained $24,312,000. For a moment, I couldn't process what I had heard. Outside, everything looked normal. A neighbor was raking leaves. Cars passed by. Yet that number echoed in my mind. $24 million. An account in my name that I didn't remember opening. I called again later to verify the information. The balance was correct. That night, sleep was impossible. My thoughts circled endlessly. There was no realistic explanation. As an accountant, I had carefully tracked every financial account I'd ever opened. There was no way I had forgotten one, especially not one connected to millions of dollars, which meant someone else had opened it. At 3 o'clock in the morning, sitting under the glow of a bedside lamp, I finally admitted to myself who I believed was responsible. Derek. Looking back, there were things about my marriage I hadn't fully understood at the time. Derek was charming. He had an effortless ability to make people feel important. He remembered details, asked thoughtful questions, and made everyone around him feel seen. For years, I confused that charm with genuine character. It wasn't character, it was talent. Beneath that polished exterior was a man who excelled at creating appearances that concealed reality. I initiated our divorce in 2014 after years of growing emotional distance. During mediation, Derek provided financial disclosures that portrayed him as someone with limited assets and modest resources. I reviewed everything carefully, both as a spouse and as a professional accountant. The documents appeared legitimate. We sold our house, divided what we supposedly had, and moved on. Now, sitting in my bedroom 10 years later, I was beginning to suspect that the entire financial picture he presented had been fabricated. The next day, I visited a local branch of Great Lakes Federal Bank. Armed with identification and the old statement, I met with a branch manager named Patricia. She confirmed that the account had been opened in 2012 using my name and social security number. It began with a deposit of $847 and eventually received numerous wire transfers totaling nearly $24 million. After 2014, the account remained untouched. When I asked who had sent the transfers, Patricia explained that she could see the originating accounts but could not legally disclose the information without a formal records request. As I left the bank and sat in my car, reality began to settle in. If my suspicions were correct, Derek had hidden millions of dollars using my identity while we were married. He had apparently intended to retrieve the money later, but for some reason, that never happened. I was frightened, but fear wasn't unfamiliar to me. I had felt it during my divorce. I had felt it when returning to full-time work. I had felt it every time I navigated life as a single parent. Fear was something I knew how to manage. I gave myself 15 minutes to be afraid. Then I began planning. First, I decided not to contact Derek. Second, I needed a lawyer with expertise in financial fraud and hidden marital assets. Third, I needed evidence. Every document, timeline, and record available. That evening, I created a folder on my computer with an intentionally boring name, Home Maintenance 2024. Inside that folder, I began building a case. The attorney I hired was Sandra Okafor, a highly experienced specialist in financial litigation and post-divorce asset recovery. After reviewing my documents, Sandra told me that if the wire transfer records confirmed what she suspected, it would be one of the strongest cases of marital asset concealment she had seen in years. She also informed me that Illinois law does not protect someone who intentionally conceals assets during divorce proceedings, regardless of how much time has passed. The investigation moved forward. Weeks later, subtle signs suggested Derek had become aware that something was happening. My son Tyler mentioned that his father had unexpectedly called and asked questions about me. That timing was too convenient to ignore. Soon afterward, the subpoenaed bank records arrived. The evidence was overwhelming. The account had been opened using my personal information and a forged version of my signature. The initial deposit was followed by 17 separate wire transfers over nearly 2 years. All of the transfers originated from 3 Delaware-based companies. Sandra's investigation revealed that every one of those companies was controlled by Derek Collins. $24 million had been transferred into an account opened under my identity without my knowledge. At that moment, every lingering doubt disappeared. The truth was finally undeniable. When I asked Sandra whether the evidence was sufficient, she looked at the file and replied, "This is more than sufficient." I authorized her to proceed with full legal action. As I signed my name, I thought about the forged signature on the original account application. Someone had carefully copied my identity in order to hide a fortune. That realization only strengthened my resolve. Within weeks, Sandra filed motions to freeze the account, submitted evidence to the court, and formally notified Derek's legal team that litigation had begun. Then I returned to my everyday life and waited. I believed I was prepared for whatever came next. I soon learned that I wasn't. It was a Thursday evening, 6 days after Sandra had officially notified Russell Hale. I was standing in my kitchen preparing dinner. A pot of pasta simmered on the stove, my phone rested on the counter, and the television murmured quietly in the background. Then my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Derek's name. We hadn't spoken directly in nearly 3 years. I watched the screen through 2 rings before finally answering. "Maggie." His voice sounded exactly as I remembered. Calm, friendly, and relaxed. It was the voice of someone who had rarely faced consequences and therefore never felt rushed by anything. "We need to talk," he said. "You can contact Sandra Okafor," I replied. "She's representing me. Any communication goes through her. I'd rather speak with you personally." After a brief pause, he continued, "This situation doesn't have to become what you're turning it into." "I'm not turning it into anything," I answered. "The evidence is doing that." For a moment, there was silence. Then the friendliness disappeared from his tone. "You should think carefully about what you're doing," he said. "I have documentation showing that you were aware of those accounts, that you agreed to the arrangement, and that everything was done with your knowledge." My grip tightened around the phone. "That's false," I said. "It doesn't matter whether it's true," he replied. "What matters is how it appears. And Maggie, I have people who will say exactly what I need them to say." That statement hit harder than anything else, because it was true. If there was one thing I knew about Derek, it was that he always knew how to gather support when it benefited him. Perhaps it was the most honest thing he had said to me in decades. "Good night, Derek." I ended the call. Standing in my kitchen, listening to the water boil behind me, I absorbed what had just happened. He was either claiming to possess fabricated evidence or preparing to create it. Witnesses, associates, former colleagues, people willing to support his version of events regardless of reality. This fight was far from over. 2 days later, things escalated. When I returned home from work, a white Range Rover sat in my driveway. I recognized it instantly. It belonged to Tiffany, Derek's wife. She stood waiting on my front porch. Tiffany was 38, perfectly groomed, impeccably dressed, and carried the kind of confidence that comes from never having to face the consequences of bad decisions. As I stepped out of my car, she smiled. It was a smile that never reached her eyes. "Maggie," she said, "I thought we could talk woman to woman." I stopped at the bottom of the steps. "You shouldn't be here. I only want to talk." She tilted her head slightly. "Derek is really upset. This whole situation is hurting the family. It's affecting your children too, whether you realize it or not." Then she mentioned Tyler and Dana by name. "Don't say my children's names," I said quietly. She ignored the warning. "Derek has evidence showing you knew about the financial arrangements. If this goes to court, it'll be your word against his. And Derek is respected. People trust him." She paused before delivering the real message. "I'm just asking you to think about what a long, public legal battle could do to your reputation, your career, and your children." It was a threat disguised as concern. I recognized the technique immediately. I had spent 15 years married to a man who used the same strategy. "You need to leave my property," I told her, "right now." For the first time, something shifted behind her smile. Without another word, she turned around, got into her vehicle, and drove away. As soon as she left, I called Sandra. I told her everything. The phone call from Derek, Tiffany's visit, and the references to evidence and witnesses. Sandra instructed me to document every detail. "Write down everything," she said. "Include dates and times. Send it to me immediately." She also noted that Derek's statements about evidence and witnesses could potentially raise concerns about obstruction. So I documented everything. Over the next week, the conflict moved into a more formal arena. Russell Hale filed 2 separate motions attempting to delay the court-ordered freeze on the account. Both requests were denied. He submitted a statement from one of Derek's former associates, claiming that I had known about overseas financial arrangements during our marriage. Sandra dismantled the statement quickly. The witness, she pointed out, had ownership interests connected to one of Derek's companies, and therefore stood to benefit financially. Another witness statement suffered the same fate. The court upheld the freeze. After that, the pressure suddenly stopped. No calls, no surprise visits, no new motions. The silence felt less like peace and more like preparation. The other side was regrouping. During that period, I allowed myself a rare break. One Saturday, I drove alone to the Indiana Dunes and spent hours walking beside the shoreline. I talked with Dana about nursing school. I slept deeply for the first time in years. The fight wasn't finished, but for the moment, the account remained frozen and the evidence was safely in the court's hands. Sometimes that is enough reason to rest. Then came the settlement offer. It arrived formally through Russell Hale on a Monday morning. Sandra forwarded it to me with a short message. "Call me after you read this." I reviewed the proposal twice. Derek was offering a private settlement. He would acknowledge irregularities related to the account's creation. In exchange, I would receive $4 million. The payment would be clean, immediate, and confidential. Both sides would sign non-disclosure agreements and permanently end all legal action. The remaining $20 million would return to Derek. $4 million. It was an intentionally chosen number, large enough to sound generous, large enough to tempt someone who had spent years managing bills, raising children, and worrying about financial security. Derek knew exactly what that amount represented to me. I called Sandra. "What do you think?" "I'll support whatever decision you make," she said. "But professionally speaking, someone doesn't offer $4 million this early unless they're worried." "You think he's scared?" "Yes." I sat quietly. Outside my office window, Chicago continued as always. Cars moved through traffic, pedestrians crossed intersections, clouds drifted across the gray November sky. I allowed myself to imagine what $4 million could do. The mortgage paid off, no student loans for Dana, a secure future for Tyler, a life without financial stress. Then I remembered the forged signature, the 17 wire transfers, the lies during mediation, the decade I spent rebuilding my life while millions sat hidden under my own name. "Tell him no," I said. There was no anger in my voice, only certainty. "Understood," Sandra replied. For the next 2 weeks, everything entered an uneasy standstill. Derek and Tiffany disappeared. No contact, no pressure, no legal attacks. Sandra informed me that Russell Hale had acknowledged our rejection and that Derek was considering his next move. Life continued. Work, dinner, household chores, ordinary routines. But there was one thing that had changed. I wasn't facing it alone anymore. The person who made the difference was my closest friend, Carolyn Webb. We had met in 2008 during a parent-teacher meeting and somehow turned a shared moment of exhaustion into a 16-year friendship. Carolyn was a paralegal, divorced herself, and completely incapable of sugarcoating anything. When I finally told her the entire story over wine at her kitchen table, she listened quietly until I finished. Then she said, "You know what bothers me most? He didn't even bother using a different name. He used yours. He was absolutely certain you'd never find it." That observation stayed with me. Carolyn became my support system. When anxiety woke me in the middle of the night, she answered my texts. When I needed perspective, she provided it. When I started doubting myself, she reminded me of the facts. One evening, I asked her whether she thought I was doing the right thing. She looked directly at me. "Maggie, he used your name, your social security number, and a forged signature to hide $24 million. Then he sat in mediation and claimed he had nothing." She shook her head. "The right thing isn't the question." I waited. "The question is whether you'll stay strong when he makes his next move. Because he absolutely will." She was right. The silence felt temporary, like a deep breath before impact. A few days later, Derek called again. This time his voice carried something familiar from the early years of our marriage. Humility, or rather, the performance of humility. "Maggie," he said, "I want to apologize. Tiffany shouldn't have come to your house. That was wrong. I'm hoping we can talk and resolve this before it goes any further." "I'll meet with you," I replied, "if our attorneys are present." I was thinking something more informal. "Attorneys present." After a pause, he agreed. 4 days later, we met in Sandra's conference room. Sandra, Russell Hale, Derek, and me. Tiffany was absent. That felt intentional. Derek arrived dressed carefully, presenting himself as calm and reasonable. For nearly 10 minutes, he spoke about mistakes and regret. He claimed he had been under pressure from business partners. He claimed he always intended to explain everything eventually. He claimed the account had been opened using my information because certain business arrangements required a domestic account holder. It was a polished performance, not a confession, not an admission of fraud, just a story about bad judgment and unfortunate circumstances. Then Russell presented a revised settlement offer, $6 million. Same confidentiality agreement, same terms. I looked at the document. Then I looked at Derek. "If you intended to disclose everything eventually," I asked quietly, "why did you forge my signature?" For the first time, his expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The warmth faded. His eyes hardened. Russell attempted to answer, arguing that the signature analysis remained disputed. But I kept looking at Derek. "You told the mediator you had no significant assets," I said. The records show 17 wire transfers. The signature was forged. I've worked in accounting for 23 years. I know exactly what these documents mean." The room fell silent. Then something happened Derek hadn't anticipated. His composure cracked, only briefly, but enough. "You have no idea what you're starting," he said quietly. "You think you're the only person capable of making life difficult?" His jaw tightened. "I built things during our marriage. You benefited from them. I gave this family a certain lifestyle." He stopped himself. Across the table, Russell looked alarmed. The mask had slipped. For a few seconds, I saw the real man underneath. Not charming, not remorseful, not misunderstood, just frightened. The kind of fear powerful people experience when they realize control is slipping away. I stood. "We're finished here," I said. Sandra nodded. The meeting ended. Outside, standing in the cold air on Michigan Avenue, I felt genuine fear. Because Derek wasn't bluffing. He was the kind of person who followed through. I knew that better than anyone. But alongside the fear came something else. Clarity. Every remaining doubt disappeared. There was no longer any conflict inside me. No lingering loyalty. No uncertainty. Only a clear understanding of what needed to happen next. I texted Carolyn. He showed his true self today. No going back now. 30 seconds later, her response arrived. "Good. Now finish it." The first major court hearing was scheduled for early December before Judge Patricia Harmon of the Cook County Circuit Court. It would be the first time both sides formally argued whether the money represented hidden marital assets subject to redistribution under Illinois law. Sandra explained Derek's strategy. He would argue that the account was a business asset, that I knew about it, that I accepted it, and that the passage of 10 years proved I had no interest in it. "The problem," Sandra said, "is that those arguments contradict one another." I wore a dark blue suit to court. That morning, Carolyn sent me a picture of a chess queen. No message, no explanation, just the image. The courtroom itself was plain and practical rather than dramatic. Judge Harmon, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and decades of experience, entered with the calm demeanor of someone who had spent years listening to every imaginable version of the truth and every imaginable version of a lie. Derek arrived at the hearing accompanied by Russell Hale and another attorney I hadn't met before, a younger lawyer responsible for presenting their financial evidence. Tiffany sat quietly in the gallery. She was elegantly dressed and carefully expressionless, as though she had been instructed not to reveal a single emotion. The hearing began with opening positions from both sides. Sandra spoke first. With calm precision, she outlined the timeline. The account opened in 2012, the forged signature, the 17 wire transfers originating from Derek's Delaware companies, and the 2014 divorce mediation where Derek had sworn under oath that he possessed no significant undisclosed assets. The phrase "under oath" carried noticeable weight. Judge Harmon made a note. Then Russell Hale stood. That was when things started to unravel. His first argument was that I had known about the account all along. To support that claim, he referenced testimony from one of Derek's former business associates, the same witness whose credibility Sandra had already weakened by demonstrating a direct financial interest in the outcome. Judge Harmon immediately questioned that conflict. Hale's response was not convincing. Next, he argued that the account should be viewed as a business vehicle rather than a marital asset. The judge asked a straightforward question. How could an account opened under my social security number and bearing a forged version of my signature be considered a business instrument instead of a personal account? Hale spent over a minute answering. When he finished, the question still hadn't been answered. Then he moved to his third argument. According to him, my failure to interact with the account over a 10-year period demonstrated acceptance of its existence. Judge Harmon looked up. "Counsel," she said, "your client's position appears to be that Ms. Collins knew about the account. At the same time, you're arguing that her lack of involvement somehow proves acceptance. How can both claims be true, especially given the ongoing dispute regarding the signature?" The courtroom grew quiet. Hale attempted an explanation. A few sentences in, the younger attorney leaned over and whispered something into his ear. He stopped, restarted, and struggled to recover. It was not a strong moment for their side. Meanwhile, Derek sat completely motionless. Most people would consider that normal. For Derek, it wasn't. He had always communicated physically, gesturing, leaning forward, engaging people directly. His stillness suggested concentration or restraint. Sandra rose for rebuttal. She delivered 3 concise points, nothing more. Then she sat down. After reviewing the arguments, Judge Harmon ordered a comprehensive forensic accounting review, approved expanded subpoenas for the Delaware companies and their financial records, and instructed both parties to submit full financial disclosures within 30 days. Before concluding, she addressed Russell Hale directly. For the record, she said, the court considers both the signature analysis and the question surrounding the 2014 financial certification highly significant. I encourage your client to evaluate his options carefully before the next hearing. It was an exceptionally polite warning. Afterward, as I exited the courthouse, I passed Derek and Tiffany in the hallway. For the first time since I had known him, Derek looked uncertain, genuinely uncertain. Tiffany's carefully controlled expression had disappeared, replaced by visible tension. She said something quietly to him. He didn't answer. Outside in the cold December air, Sandra walked beside me. After a moment, she said, "That went well." "Yes," I replied. And it had. What I felt wasn't relief. It was something quieter. The hearing wasn't the end of the case, but it was the moment when the outcome became visible. The path forward had finally taken shape. From the parking garage, I called Carolyn. She answered immediately. "How'd it go?" "He couldn't keep all 3 arguments standing at the same time," I said. She laughed. "Of course he couldn't," she replied. "He's not nearly as clever as he thinks. He just spent years playing against someone who wasn't paying attention." "I'm paying attention now." "I know," she said. "You have been for a while." The next 4 months were a gradual unraveling of everything Derek had built. The expanded subpoenas revealed exactly what Sandra expected. The 3 Delaware companies, MCF Holdings, Granite Bridge Consulting, and a third company called Blue Shore Partners, created a financial trail that became impossible to ignore once mapped chronologically. Blue Shore had received payments during our marriage from businesses Derek had claimed he no longer had relationships with. Money moved through multiple layers of corporate entities before eventually landing in the Great Lakes federal account. The structure looked complicated, but it wasn't impossible to understand. Once Sandra's forensic accountant completed the analysis, the pattern was obvious. For years before our divorce, Derek had been hiding assets and income through a deliberate system of corporate layering. The account in my name had served as the final destination, a place where the money could remain concealed until he felt safe accessing it. According to Sandra's theory, he never touched the account because events changed unexpectedly. In 2015, Blue Shore Partners became involved in a separate civil dispute. That increased the risk of scrutiny. Instead of moving the money, Derek left it untouched. Months became years. The account remained dormant, waiting, still carrying my name. Then, in March, Judge Harmon issued her decision. She ruled that the funds in the Great Lakes federal account were marital assets intentionally concealed during the divorce proceedings. She found that Derek's 2014 financial disclosures were materially false. The account balance, along with accrued interest, was awarded to me as part of an equitable settlement. Additionally, she referred the issue of the false certification to the Cook County State's attorney for review. Sandra hadn't requested that referral. The judge made the decision independently. She also ordered Derek to pay attorney fees. That detail carried its own message. The final amount transferred to me after legal expenses and procedural costs totaled $22.7 million. I was sitting in Sandra's conference room when confirmation arrived. She turned her laptop toward me. "There it is," she said. I looked at the screen, then at her. "It's real." I nodded. People often imagine moments like that as dramatic. They expect music, emotion, or some overwhelming sense of triumph. For me, it felt none of those things. It felt quiet, still, exhausted in the best possible way, like reaching the end of a very long journey and finally being allowed to stop walking. I had been carrying this burden for a long time. Now I could set it down. Derek chose not to appeal. According to Sandra, Russell Hale strongly advised against it, especially given the criminal referral. Derek signed the transfer authorization without objection. Surprisingly, I felt no curiosity about his reaction. I no longer needed to know. The afternoon the transfer became official, I drove straight to Carolyn's house. Using the spare key she had given me years earlier, I let myself inside and found her making tea in the kitchen. I told her the final number. She set down her mug. 22.7 million? Yes. We sat at the kitchen table in silence for nearly half a minute. Then she reached across and squeezed my hand. "Maggie," she said softly, "you actually did it." And I had. Not through dramatic confrontations, not through speeches, not through some cinematic moment of revenge. I succeeded the same way I had handled most challenges in life. Preparation, documentation, patience, and a refusal to be manipulated by pressure, money, or charm. Derek had always assumed I wouldn't look closely enough. He had been wrong. The first thing I did with the money was pay off my house in Oak Park. After completing the paperwork, I sat in my car holding the confirmation documents. That home had carried me through a difficult decade. Now it belonged entirely to me. It felt right. Next, I established educational trusts for Tyler and Dana. Their student loans disappeared. Graduate school, if they wanted it, would be fully funded. Their futures were secure. When I told Tyler, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Mom, are you okay?" I told him I was better than I had been in years. Dana cried, then I cried, then we both laughed. The third thing I did was quietly pay off the remaining years on Carolyn's mortgage. I didn't warn her. I simply did it. When I told her afterward, she immediately protested. "Maggie, you can't do that." "It's already done," I replied. For once, Carolyn had no argument. She cried instead, which naturally caused me to cry again. It was becoming a habit. I decided that was perfectly acceptable. The following spring, I left my accounting firm on excellent terms. I completed my projects, gave proper notice, and stepped away. Then I spent 3 months doing almost nothing. I read, I walked, I visited the Indiana Dunes again. I spent time with Tyler and Dana. We shared meals and talked about their lives. For the first time in years, I experienced the luxury of being fully present. The constant background noise of financial anxiety was gone. Later that year, I launched a small consulting practice focused on divorce finances and asset division. It was work I understood deeply, work I found meaningful, work entirely on my own terms. As for Derek, the state's attorney eventually pursued a criminal perjury charge connected to his 2014 financial certification. He accepted a plea agreement. The result included probation, a substantial financial penalty, and a permanent mark on his professional record. He also lost several consulting contracts after details of the case appeared in a local business publication. The reputation he had spent years building never fully recovered. 14 months after the civil ruling, Tiffany filed for divorce. I never investigated further. Their marriage was no longer my concern. The Scottsdale vacation property was eventually sold as part of Derek's financial restructuring. Tyler later mentioned that his father had moved into a smaller apartment. I listened politely. Nothing more. I felt no satisfaction in his decline. What I felt instead was distance. Peaceful distance. The kind that comes when someone who once had enormous influence over your life no longer occupies any space in your thoughts. Derek had taken years from me. He had taken opportunities. He had taken a settlement I deserved. But he had not taken everything. One evening the following October, exactly 1 year after finding that forgotten envelope, I sat on my back porch watching sunlight filter through the oak tree in my yard. The leaves were changing colors. The air was cool. My coffee was warm. For once, there was nowhere I needed to be. I thought about the woman who had opened that envelope 12 months earlier, how exhausted she had been, how frightened, how uncertain, and yet, beneath all of it, how determined she had quietly been to face the truth. I was grateful she had.